Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world. And I hope you're having a lovely day. I've had a beautiful day, the weather's been fantastic and I've been watching so many birds in the garden. So it's really lovely at this time of year and I hope it is where you are. And if you're going to relax, go and get yourself something lovely to drink. And if I've never heard of that drink, tell me about it because I always love to hear about your little indulgences. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. What are you saying, Mum, exactly? Why on earth would my birth mother want to keep stuff from me? It makes no sense. Are you saying my biological mother was a distant relative that didn't want me and gave me up for adoption to you? Because if that's the case, why don't you just go ahead and say it? If my biological mother really didn't want me, I'd like to know. And you know what, Mum? I can deal with it. I'm a big girl now. I'm 15 years old. You're getting ahead of yourself again, Blakely. For goodness sake, girl, would you please calm down? You need to understand the whole story, because I can assure you that you're barking up the wrong tree yet again. With all your far-fetched, rather ludicrous theories that don't bear any relation to the truth whatsoever. On the contrary, as hard as it may be for you to believe, your mother, Blakely, wanted you very much. And when I say wanted you, she couldn't wait for you to be born. She was thrilled to learn she was expecting a baby girl. She'd always wanted a girl. Before you were born, she decided that when she had a girl, it would be called Blakely, after a favourite character of hers in a children's novel. She decided on that name for you when she was only 12 years old. That was how committed she was to one day being a mother. She would say to me, one day when I grow up and have a baby girl, I'm going to call her Blakely. So she wanted me? Asked Blakely, sounding so shocked, for in her mind's eye, it was almost impossible to believe that anyone could ever want her. Growing up, she'd been all too well aware that the woman she always believed was her biological mother didn't want her. So the fact that her real biological mother did was almost incomprehensible to believe and to understand. But if that were really the case, why had her biological mother abandoned her in the way she had obviously done, and expected Hilda Martini to raise her as her own, when even Hilda Martini admitted that she was a useless mother, and never was a truer word spoken in that regard. What you don't know, Blakely, which is something I never shared with you before, because it really hurts to talk about this for me, that I was a twin, an identical twin. My twin sister's name was Peggy. We were incredibly close, inseparable actually. And when Hilda Martini said this, a bright light came on in her eyes, as if she was remembering some very special moments from the past that were incredibly dear to her. And it was the first time Blakely had seen just a shred of happiness in her mother's eyes. But the spark didn't last for terribly long, as her mother's expression seemed to flatline and become quite melancholic. You were a twin? Asked Blakely, her eyes widening in astonishment. But are you being serious? Why didn't you say anything before? Did you look exactly the same as your sister? You were identical? That's what identical means, Blakely. You couldn't tell us apart. My mother would dress us up in identical clothes, and we would look meticulous. My mother showed us off to all and sundry, like she did this house. Believe it or not, this house we are living in now used to be the most beautiful house in the whole street, until I allowed it to descend into chaos, I'm afraid. If my mother could see how I've let this place fall apart, she'd be very disgusted and bitterly disappointed with me. But life has been tough. Anyway, me and my sister were the pride of my mother's life. I remember the fun we'd have back in those days, being identical. We used to confuse the teachers at school. They were unable to figure out who was who, and we loved exchanging places with each other just so that we could mess people around. We always thought it was hilariously funny. Peggy and I were so alike But when we got older, we both had different jobs. I guess we wanted to find our own identities in life. We were very close, you know. So where is your sister now? Well, it's a long story, Blakely. I'm listening, Mum. I need to hear this. Hilda Martini paused for a brief moment. Her fingers were now really shaking. They seemed rather unsteady. As she took a puff of her cigarette, blowing yet more white smoke into the television room, Blakely could see that whatever her mother was about to tell her was not something that would be easy. Well, said Hilda Martini rather cautiously, this is the part of the story, Blakely, is not going to make for easy listening on your account. Go on, Mum. I'm willing to hear anything you have to tell me. I just need to know the truth. That's all that matters to me. One day, my twin sister Peggy was returning home from work. I didn't work with her. We had different jobs at the time. She was working as a secretary for an exclusive car company. Goodness gracious me, my memory is so vague. I can't remember the name of the company now. Sadly, the place no longer exists. The company moved away. But it used to be 3 streets away from this house, and it had a huge showroom. Spectacular it was back in the day. That was situated right next to the local gas station, along with a collection of vintage shops. I think there was a butcher and a bakery shop, a sweet shop, a couple of coffee shops, where you could buy a sandwich and have a cup of tea from time to time. It's certainly changed a great deal over the years. Anyway, my sister Peggy, she'd organise all the paperwork for the car company, and sometimes she was swamped and inundated with so much work that she'd leave the offices rather late. And when she returned home, she'd walk the 3 streets to this street, and it wasn't uncommon for people back then to walk in the evenings. But unfortunately, one evening my sister could sense someone was walking behind her on the sidewalk, a street away from this house. She could tell they were in a desperate hurry, for they were moving very quickly, and not for a minute did she suspect they had any insidious motives as far as she was concerned. So she slowed down to let the person overtake her. She didn't want to block their path. Peggy was very considerate like that, you know. She always thought of others before herself. Sadly, instead of overtaking her, the man suddenly pulled down the cap he was wearing over his head, which turned out to be a balaclava. He then grabbed her rather roughly, holding a knife to her throat and demanding for her to be quiet and not to scream or he'd kill her at once. The man dragged Peggy behind a bush into someone's front yard. And well, unfortunately, the man did the most unthinkable thing to my sister. She said the man was of medium build, smelled pungently of sweat mixed with some rank aftershave. There was the smell of beer on his breath, as if he'd drunk way too much. And he had brown, very cruel eyes. She did remember that very clearly. I will spare you the grisly details of her encounter with this man, because you know exactly what I'm implying here. To cut a long story short, that nasty, vicious thug of a man impregnated my beautiful sister with his sperm and left her for dead behind that bush. He slashed her throat and was gone without a care in the world. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, Blakely, but that odious man was your father. There were no more incidents of women being attacked in the area at the time, so who this man was is anybody's guess. Many people in town believe that this man, whoever he was nursing a secret fixation on my sister, and had possibly been stalking her for a long time, and one day decided to act out on his fantasies. But whoever he was, he left her for dead. I can't get my head around that. The man that attacked your sister was my father. Your sister was my mother, said Blakely. You're kidding, right? I wish I was, Blakely, but I don't make jokes like this. I may be many things, and I admit I haven't been the greatest mother to you, but I wouldn't be so cruel as to make something as insidious as this up. It was very fortunate that a man had just happened to be walking his dog at the time, and was able to find my sister Peggy. The dog broke loose from his lead, and began to bark frantically around the bush where Peggy was lying. It was as if something was there, that was bothering the dog. The man kept calling his dog to come back to him, but his normally obedient dog was going completely ballistic and running into the bush rather frantically. He kept making a strange sound at the back of his throat that the man had never heard before, like a long, sad whine. The man was getting rather disquieted by the whole thing and angry with his dog, so he tried to grab the leash so he could get hold of his dog. "Get back here, Howie," he called out. But Howie went behind the bush and retrieved something, running back to his owner and dropping it at his owner's feet. It was one of my sister's shoes, would you believe it? The man took a look at the shoe, and in that moment he sensed something was very off. He glanced quickly behind the bush to take a second look at what had fixated his dog so much. The man suddenly saw my sister's arm sticking out of the edge of the bush. The arm was so white and ghost-like in the fading light of the early evening that he thought he was seeing a mannequin. He got closer and discovered Peggy. He saw her lying there on the ground, naked from the waist down. He knew at once she'd been sexually assaulted, of course, by someone, and there was blood all over her shirt. He was horrified that something as horrific as this had occurred in our very serene neighbourhood, and unfortunately the people who owned the house never got to see the attack. The man saw the gash across my sister's neck and realised she was in trouble, because he knew her throat had been slashed. She didn't appear to be moving, so there was a point he believed she might be dead. So he ran to the house to alert the owner, who had already come to the front yard because the dog was barking so much. So he knew something was up. They called 911, and Peggy was rushed to the hospital immediately. I'm so very glad to say she made a full recovery, much to everyone's relief, especially my mother, who was in quite the state, let me tell you. My beloved sister took the attack very badly, you know. She was never the same after the incident, but I can completely understand why. My mother said that after that terrible event, we all became very broken as a family, and I don't think a truer word was ever spoken. Every time Peggy went out after that, she was cautiously looking over her shoulder, almost as if expecting someone to pounce out of the dark shadows with a knife. My mother would physically go and pick up my sister from work every day, because my sister never wanted to walk home at night again, and everywhere she went she carried a bottle of mace on her person. She was supposed to move out of my mother's house, you know, into an apartment of her own, that she intended to rent, but she decided to stay with my mother in the house, this house, because she was too afraid to be left alone. Her independence had been stolen. She was, of course, encouraged by my mother to go to the police about the whole incident, to file a report, but she point-blank refused. For weeks she'd scrub herself so very hard that the skin would come away from the flesh. She never ever felt clean. She told me she felt so dirty after that man did all that to her. I remember wishing I was the one that had been attacked rather than my sister. For out of the two of us, she was the sensitive one, who took things way too hard. One day she discovered that she was pregnant with you, and that came as a bolt out of the blue, let me tell you. My mother was attacked by this horrible, horrible man, and falls pregnant with me, said Blakely, going very white. She realised that this vile, repugnant man, who had tried to murder her biological mother, was actually her biological father, and the very thought made her sick to her stomach. This was not something easy to digest, for she was carrying this man's DNA in her blood, and so did that make her a monster too, she wondered. It's not easy to hear any of this, is it, dear? I'm very sorry, said Blakely's mother. But the good news is my sister refused to abort you. My mother told her once you were born that she should put you up for adoption, so she didn't have to be reminded of what that horrible man had done to her. My sister Peggy said that you were her baby, and that you were the only good thing that had come out of that god-awful experience, and there was no way on God's earth she'd be parted with you, or give you up for adoption. She believed emphatically that all life is precious, and that you were a gift from God himself. She was very excited about having you, you know.
She really loved you, and after you were born she couldn't take her eyes off you. She thought you were the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her entire life. In truth, when she held you in her arms, I don't think I've ever seen my sister more happy. Oh, she was so full of joy. Unlike me, my sister was born to be a mother.
Well, if she loved me so much, then why did she abandon me like she did? Where is she now?
She's not around any more, Blakely, I'm afraid, said Hilda Martina, hanging her head rather sorrowfully. Losing her was the hardest thing in my entire life. Me and my mother, we fell apart. When you have a twin sister, Blakely, you're connected to that person more than anyone else in the entire world, because that person understands how you think. So when you lose someone that close to you, you feel as if half of you has been amputated, if you know what I mean.
Well, then where is she? Asked Blakely, looking around the television room, as if half expecting her mother to materialise from the shadows, like a piece of jewellery you've lost behind the sofa that suddenly makes a startling reappearance after years of being estranged.
Your mother's dead, said Hilda Martini. I'm very sorry, Blakely. I know it's not what you want to hear.
Dead? But how? Why? Asked Blakely, a tear trickling down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. If she started to cry in front of her mother now, she'd likely shut down the conversation, and Blakely needed to know what there was to know about her late mother. So she tried to remain stoic, but it was almost impossibly hard to do so.
I might as well tell you, said Hilda Martini, because you need to know the truth. 2 years after you were born, Peggy developed an inoperable form of brain cancer and subsequently died when you were about 3.5 years old, I think it was. It was all desperately sad. We were completely devastated by everything. Your grandmother very much believed the trauma of the attack was the cause of the cancer. She believed every disease has an emotional root. She'd say if a plant was traumatized, it would quickly fade, and she felt humans were much the same. I believe she was right about that. Even Peggy figured out the cancer was brought on by the trauma she experienced after being attacked by that man. She admitted she hadn't dealt with her post-traumatic stress, and as a consequence the stress had manifested itself in her body in a very deadly form of cancer. She was given some aggressive cancer treatments, of course, but they only made her violently sick. So in the end she refused any further treatments. She decided to enjoy the quality life she had left with you and with the family before she passed away. We certainly had some good times together as a family, before she did finally kick the bucket. But after Peggy was gone, life was never the same for any of us.
I'm so sorry, Mum. I don't know what to say. I had no idea.
There is no need to apologise, Blakely. None of this was ever your fault. Stuff happens in life, you know, and it's not always pretty, I'm afraid. But what do? You pick up the pieces and get on with your life, don't you? That's why I've always told you, Blakely, don't ever look back at the past and dwell on things, because it never does anyone any good. It's important to focus on each day as it comes, to focus on the future. That's what I try to do.
I suppose so, said Blakely.
Anyway, before Peggy died, she begged me to adopt you as my child. She wanted me to raise you myself, because she saw herself in me, of course, because I was her identical twin. I was the obvious person for her to give her child to, I suppose. I didn't want to have any children, and she knew I wasn't the maternal type, but I rather suspect she thought I could be changed. I couldn't refuse my sister her last request, so I took you in as my own, and that's how I came to being your mother. I adopted you before my sister died, so that she could leave this world in peace, not having to worry about your welfare. She didn't want you to ever know the truth about who your father was. She felt very strongly that if you knew it, it might tear you apart. But I did tell her there might be a day when I was compelled to tell you the truth, because she knew how much I abhorred lying of any kind.
Ma'am, I will admit this is so hard to digest. My father was an absolute monster, and my biological mother is your sister. Well, was your sister, and she's dead now.
That's why you shouldn't ask so many questions, Blakely, like you tend to do. Sometimes in life, as I've always said, it's best not to know the truth. The truth can sting, especially knowing your father was a sexual deviant of sorts. That's got to hurt like hell. I'm very sorry that I had to tell you this, Blakely. I do know life has not been easy for you, growing up under my charge. I'm not exactly the most wonderful mother. Believe it or not, as I keep saying, I'm very aware of my shortcomings and failings, but despite everything, and contrary to what you may actually believe, I do have your best interests at heart. And you are important to me, because you are my sister's child. And I loved my sister more than life itself. So even though I'm not affectionate, underneath it all, Blakely, I do actually care. And you do have some of your late mother's very good qualities, I have to say.
It had been startling for Blakely to hear Hilda Martini confess to so many horrifying truths that had turned everything Blakely thought she knew onto its head. Also hearing the woman she always assumed was her real mother expressing any form of affection towards her was rather bewildering. But it had been so good to hear, and a long time in coming. It may have seemed that Hilda Martini did not love her, but now Blakely understood that her mother was not wired to be emotional, and maybe after everything her sister had been through, she had become so devastated, not only by her sister's attack, but also because her twin sister had passed away, and she might indirectly be blaming Blakely's biological father for doing this to Peggy. Was it possible that underneath it all she was harbouring a secret resentment towards Blakely, knowing full well that she was carrying some of the DNA of the man that had attacked her sister? Somehow these revelations had now enabled Blakely to understand her mother's insouciance all the more. It was clear her mother had loved her identical twin sister, and now she was gone from their lives. Perhaps her mother felt a little lost and was trying to keep her head above the water, and yet when you looked around the house and saw the chaotic state it was in, was it not a reflection of how messed up her mother was on the inside? It was after Blakely had had this heart-to-heart conversation with her mother, probably the longest interaction she'd ever had with her. But now she understood perfectly that her mother was not wired to be emotional, and had admitted as much. Maybe after everything her sister Peggy had been through, her mother had become so devastated and broken up, not only by her sister's attack, but also because Peggy had passed away prematurely, and maybe underneath it all, she blamed Blakely's biological father for doing this to her sister. Was it possible that Hilda Martini, her mother, was harbouring a secret resentment towards Blakely, knowing full well that she happened to be carrying some of the DNA of the man that had attacked her sister in her blood? These revelations had now enabled Blakely to understand her mother's insouciance all the more. It was clear her mother had loved her identical twin sister, and now she was gone from their lives. Perhaps her mother felt a little lost and was trying to keep her head above the water all the time. And when you looked around the house and saw the chaotic upheaval, was it not a reflection of how messed up her mother really was on the inside? And was it any surprise that she felt like this? Not really. It was after Blakely had had this heart-to-heart conversation with her mother, probably the longest interaction she'd ever enjoyed with her, she began to fully comprehend her mother a whole lot more. She could now put the jigsaw pieces together, and what she had learnt had been completely shattering, and certainly life-altering. Her mother was right about some things, that they were best not knowing. The irony is that after Blakely's mother had told her all these truths about her biological mother, their relationship exponentially changed. It would seem her mother became more upbeat, as if a terrible weight she'd been carrying for a long time had finally been removed from her shoulders, and these days her mother was showing more interest in her, and the television dinners they enjoyed together were becoming a whole lot more sociable. Sylvia. Shortly after my best friend Blakely Martini's 15th birthday, I noticed she'd become very withdrawn. It was like she shrank away in her shell and didn't seem to want to partake of anything, so I knew something was decidedly wrong. I wanted to shake my friend vigorously hard, get her out of her lugubrious melancholia, so to speak. But the only way I could do this was to ask her what the hell was going on with her. But Blakely seemed to be pushing me away, almost as if she didn't want to talk to me about anything. I wanted to know what was bothering her, for it was so unlike my best friend to push me away like this. She had always confided in me about everything. She had clammed up rather like a mussel in its shell, and when I asked her what was up, she wore a frown on her face and pushed me away and told me nothing was wrong and that she was perfectly fine, thank you very much. But I wasn't stupid, nor was I born yesterday. I knew my friend was far from fine. But how do you help someone that doesn't want to be helped? I knew that Blakely had her problems. Of course I did. She had confided in me that her home life was rather dysfunctional, and I'd gathered as much, because you only had to look at Blakely to know she was quite a messed up person. Blakely had no idea who her father was, and was frightened to even ask her mother about such things. She was very worried that her mother would bite her head off. She said that her mother could get affronted at the best of times, especially if you asked her questions that concerned her past that she simply did not want to answer. Blakely's mother, from what I'd seen personally, was quite a reserved person. She kept her thoughts privately to herself, so it was close to impossible for Blakely to establish any kind of meaningful connection with her mother, especially now that she had become a teenager. Hilda Martini worked at the liquor store in town, and had done so for many long years. She was efficient and extremely good at her job, with a no-nonsense approach towards difficult customers. She hadn't managed to befriend any people at work, which I couldn't help but think was an awful shame. She wasn't easy to get along with from what I'd gathered, and that was because Hilda Martini seemed to push people away, especially if they expressed a keen interest in getting to know her better. My mother, for example, had visited her once to ask her to a family barbecue, so we could get to know her better. But Hilda Martini had said, "That isn't a good idea. I'm going to have to refuse your invite, I'm afraid." And that was my mother, well and truly put in her place. She never ever asked Hilda Martini out again. Blakely told me that Hilda Martini really had an innate ability to cut you down to size when she wanted to, and make you feel as small as an ant. And to date, she seemed to have point-blank refused to tell Blakely anything about her past, which was extremely unfortunate. Did Blakely not have a right to know who her biological father was, and if she might potentially have any half-brothers and sisters? But Blakely was terrified, far too terrified to upset the apple cart by asking her mother questions that she clearly didn't want to answer. She told me her mother would say, "If it's in the past, Blakely, leave it where it belongs, and move forward in the future, why don't you?" When I met Mrs. Martini for the very first time, I understood exactly what Blakely had meant about her being extremely aloof. Actually, that was an understatement. She seemed to always be in a bad mood. It might have had something to do with the fact that I've never seen her face break out into a smile. I would bet that if she did smile, she might actually look quite attractive, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. For like a flower blooming in a desert, Mrs. Martini probably smiles once in a blue moon. I personally believe that Hilda Martini is a very sad woman. She reminds me of what our dog Penny was like when we first got her from the shelter and brought her back home with us. She's a cane terrier, and would hide herself under the bed for several weeks, until she began to realize that me and my family meant her no harm. She had been used in animal trials and shown absolutely no affection at all. Scientists used her, as they did the other animals, to test their drugs on them. And many of those trials were performed on Penny, I'm afraid, and it makes me sick to my stomach just to think about it. I truly think Hilda Martini had a lost, far-away look in those dark eyes of hers, almost as if wounds from her past simply could not be healed. So me and my mother both believed something bad must have happened to her when she was younger. My mother thought it might be connected to Blakely's father, perhaps. She thought maybe he had abandoned her when she discovered she was pregnant with Blakely, and perhaps Mrs. Martini never got over the feelings of being rejected like that. When Blakely introduced me to her mother for the first time, she barely acknowledged me and mumbled hello under her breath and sashayed off to watch television, which I thought was awfully rude. But then I realised that hurting people hurt people, so I chose not to take offence by Hilda Martini's rather abrupt manner towards me. In the beginning, Blakely had been extremely ashamed to ask me around to her house. She told me it was a deplorable mess. She didn't want anyone to see it. She'd prefer to spend time at my home instead. I soon found out why she was avoiding asking me around, as Blakely wasn't exaggerating at all. Her house was chaos itself, the kind of rough and tumble place that looks like it's been hit by a tornado, and nature has run rampant all over the yard. When I visited the house on the edge of 7th Street, I was so taken aback by the very sight of the place. Honestly, there are no words to describe it to you. It was in such a bad state of repair. Even the front door looked like someone with sharp nails had tried to break in, as it was covered in those ghastly scratches, along with a plethora of peeling paint. It was like the sorry, soulless house was falling apart before my very eyes, and I rather think it reflected what was going on in Blakely's own life. I think much like Blakely's mother, she was quite a broken person underneath it all, who tried desperately hard to put on a happy face to the world. But underneath it all she was hurting very much, because her mother failed to show her the love she so obviously deserved. And without having a father in the picture, I think sometimes she felt horribly alone, as if she didn't even really know who she was. If I thought the house on the outside was bad enough, with its overgrown yard and crumbling windows, the inside of Blakely's home was worse than I could have ever envisaged. But luckily she kept her bedroom in reasonably good condition. But I was shocked that a woman like Mrs. Martini would allow her house to descend into such decay. I knew if she didn't attend to the long list of maintenance jobs her house needed to undergo, one day they might not be fixable at all. And God forbid if that roof started to leak. It would be the beginning of the end for the Martini family. After school I was naturally rather reluctant to spend any time at Blakely's house, given the condition it was in, and it certainly didn't help that I genuinely didn't like to be around her mother. I'm not exactly sure how Blakely and I became friends. I think it all started when I noticed she was always sitting alone on the school playground, looking very sorry for herself, rather like a scolded dog that is hiding in the corner, so nobody can actually notice it. I've always been a bit of a sucker for a sad face, which is why I'm naturally drawn to abandoned animals that have been left so cruelly to fend for themselves, which was why I had to rescue Penny from the shelter when she was cowering in the corner of her cage. The woman at the shelter told me that if no one took Penny in the next 24 hours or so, she'd have to be euthanized, and me, being as soppy as I am, couldn't possibly allow that to happen. These days my dog Penny is such a self-assured, confident dog, a far cry from what she used to be when I first saw her at the shelter that day. I think I thought Blakely, much like my dog Penny, needed rescuing. On the day that Blakely and I were to become friends, I approached her somewhat cautiously, under the large umbrella of the sycamore tree on the school playground, where she appeared to be sitting, all on her own, cross-legged and eating a ham and cheese sandwich with her nose buried in a book. When she looked up at me through those dark eyes of hers, she said rather rudely, "What do you want?" I know animals can growl at you when they've been abandoned, which is more out of a fear response than anything else, because they've suffered some kind of abuse and are rather suspicious of strangers. Blakely was being extremely guarded towards me, so I wasn't put off by the brush-off I received from her. I sat down on the grass a couple of feet away from her and proceeded to open up my own lunchbox. I pulled out a tuna mayonnaise sandwich, and I took a bite, and with my mouth half full, I asked her rather casually, "What are you reading?" For a moment Blakely didn't bother to answer me, so there was a stiff, awkward silence between us for a while. But I was patient and decided I wasn't going to go anywhere until in some way I had connected with this very unsocial girl who seemed to be very successful at pushing people away. I thought she was going to brazenly ignore me and pretend I wasn't there, but she surprised me by saying, The 39 Steps. But she continued to look down at her book and refused to meet my gaze. Why do you ask? Do you always want to know what people are reading? No, I'm just curious, I said. I've never been a big reader myself, you see, but I do like to read a good mystery once in a while. Something that keeps me on the edge of my chair, if you know what I mean. I've never liked Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. I'm just not into witchcraft, and I've never been impressed by any of the stories. Also, our pastor at church discourages us to read those kind of books. You should see my father. Like me, he loves a good mystery. He's fixated by Agatha Christie. His favourite story was Murder on the Orient Express. My mother said when my father first read that book, they had guests arriving for dinner that evening, and in the middle of dinner my father went and locked himself in the downstairs toilet. He claimed he had a very bad bout of food poisoning, so my mother was left entertaining their guests that evening. They were beginning to worry that my mother's food would also leave them with a dicky tummy, so they left most of the food on their plates that my mother had taken hours to prepare. My dad only admitted years later that he hadn't actually had food poisoning, but had sneaked off to the toilet to finish the book because it captivated his attention so much, and had only returned to bed at 5:10 in the morning once the book was complete. When my mother heard this, she wasn't best pleased, I can assure you. But when I heard the story, I thought it was absolutely hilarious. Are you familiar with Murder on the Orient Express by any chance? Of course I am, said Blakely, as if I was asking a very stupid question. But at least I'd managed to get through to her. If you haven't heard of Murder in the Orient Express, you've got to be living in a parallel universe, haven't you? Said Blakely. It's an absolute classic. I suppose it is, I agreed. So there we are, that is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.